I'm Skaji. I'm a practicing witch and a professional tarot nerd, and today I'm a storyteller. And I'm glad you're here. This is part 3 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, abridged and adapted after a fashion by me. This novella was first published on December 19th, 1843. Awakening in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was once again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's intervention. But finding himself worrying that he did not know where this new specter would appear, he tried to look about himself everywhere all at once, and established a sharp lookout all round the bed. For he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise and made nervous. I don't mind calling on you to believe that Scrooge was ready for a good broad field of strange appearances, and that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astonished him very much. Now, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently, when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon the bed, the very center of a blaze of ruddy light, which at first streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts. At last, however, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. This idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge reached the door, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter, and he obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, nor in Marley's. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were the makings of a grand feast indeed. Turkey, ham, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up, high up, to shed its light on Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. "Come in," exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better, man." Scrooge entered timidly and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe or mantle bordered with white fur, Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free, free as its genial face, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, and its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard, but no sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "Have never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these later years," pursued the phantom. I don't think I have," said Scrooge. "I am afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, spirit?" "Many thousands," said the ghost. "A tremendous family to provide for," muttered Scrooge. The ghost of Christmas Present rose. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, red berries, ivy, turkey, ham, sausages, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch, all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. The weather was cold and severe, yet all around there were people making a brisk and not unpleasant kind of music and scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses, whence it was a delight to the scores of children rushing about hither and thither to see it coming pluming down onto the road below and splitting into an artificial little snowstorm. The house fronts looked dark enough, and the windows darker in contrast with the smooth white sheet of snow on the roofs. The sky was gloomy, half-thawed, half-frozen, and smoky, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had by one consent caught fire and were blazing away to their dear heart's content. In spite of the cold and the gloom, there was an air of cheerfulness abroad that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun could not match. For the people shoveling away the snow and the excited children were happy and full of glee, calling out to one another and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, better-natured missile far than many a wordy jest, laughing loudly if it went right and no less loudly if it went wrong. The ghost of Christmas Present, giant as he was, walked lightly through the streets, leaving nary a footprint in his passing, and Scrooge with him. Presently, doors all round opened, and shovelers and children alike were called back inside. Soon thereafter, the doors opened again, and out came a pouring of people, such that the streets were soon abustle with them. And fathers and mothers and older brothers and sisters all carried something, while the little ones scampered all around. There were brightly wrapped presents and steaming hot dishes and cloth-covered platters. The air was filled with laughter and with song. It seemed to Scrooge that the streets filled with people visiting others, that it should be that there would be no one left at home to receive them. And then a little laugh escaped Scrooge, as much a surprise to him as to anyone who might have heard it, when he thought that it surely seemed that everyone had, today of all days, decided to trade homes. The sight of these revelers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in a doorway and sprinkled sparkling embers on their dishes from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. So it was. "Is there a particular flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given, to a poor one the most." "Why to a poor one the most?" asked Scrooge. "Because it needs it the most." "Spirit," said Scrooge after a moment's thought, I wonder you, of all the beings in the many worlds about us, should desire to cramp these people's opportunities of innocent enjoyment." "I?" cried the Spirit. "You would deprive them of their means of dining every seventh day, often the only day on which they can be said to dine at all," said Scrooge. "I?" cried the Spirit. "You seek to close these places on the seventh day," said Scrooge, "and it comes to the same thing." "Not I," exclaimed the Spirit. "Forgive me if I am wrong. It has been done in your name, or at least in that of your family," said Scrooge. "There are some upon this earth of yours," returned the Spirit, "who lay claim to know us, and who do their deeds of passion, pride, ill will, hatred, envy, bigotry, and selfishness in our name, who are as strange to us and all our kith and kin as if they had never lived. Remember that, and charge their doings on themselves, not us." Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on invisible as they had been before into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure that the good Spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerks. For there he went and took Scrooge with him, holding on to his robe. And on the threshold of the door the Spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that. The ghost of Christmas present blessed his modest four-room house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a second-hand gown and spruced up with ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for little. And she laid out the tablecloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also bedecked in ribbons. Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the sleeves of his own overlarge shirt, Bob's private property conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, getting his sleeves into the pot, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in all the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced around the table and exalted Peter to the skies, while he, not proud, although his shirt nearly enveloped him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother, Tiny Tim, and Martha?" "Here's Martha, mother," said a girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried two younger Cratchits. "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "Well, never mind, so long as you are here," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit down before the fire, my dear, and warm yourself. Bless you." "Oh, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of blanket, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit, a covert smile upon her lips. "Not coming?" said Bob, crestfallen, for he had been Tim's horse all the way from church and had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day?" Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, even if it were only in joke. So she came out from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house that he might hear the pies bubbling in the oven. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credulity and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day how blessed they were to have their own health." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to his stool before the fire, and while Bob, turning up his cuffs, stirred some hot mixture simmering in a pan. Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy hissing hot. Peter mashed the potatoes with an incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause before Mrs. Cratchit carved the goose, and when she did, the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, and one murmur of delight arose all around the table, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" Bob said he didn't believe there was ever such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family indeed, and Mrs. Cratchit said so with great delight. Everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone to bring in the pies. Oh, such wonderful pies. Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she would confess that she had had her doubts about the quantity of the flour. Yet everyone had something good to say about it. At last, the dinner was all done. The cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The simmering drink in the pot being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovel full of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and at Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the pot, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears, God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here." Scrooge hung his head and was overcome with penitence and grief, and cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed," cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children, Christmas Day." "It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's," said Mrs. Cratchit, "not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. And he'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care 2 pence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before, for the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. Thereafter they sang bright songs and told humorous stories, and all this time the chestnuts and the jug went round, and by they had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sparklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially upon Tiny Tim, until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baked through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running out into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and to be the first to greet them. Blessings on it, how the ghost exulted, how it opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and dreary moor, where monstrous masses of rude stone were cast about as though it were the burial place of giants. And water spread itself wheresoever it listed, or would have done so but for the frost that held it prisoner. And nothing grew but moss and furze and coarse rank grass. Down in the west the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red, which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of the darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live who labor deep within the earth. But they know. See?" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire. An old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out brightly in their holiday attire. The old man was singing them a Christmas song, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. The Spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing on above the moor, sped over the coast and beyond it to the sea. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged among the dreadful caverns it had worn and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rock, some league or so from shore, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds rose and fell about it, like the waves that they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire, that through the loophole in the thick stone wall shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their calloused hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their can of grog, and one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, as the figure of an old ship might be, he struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, until being far away, as he told Scrooge from any shore, they lighted upon a ship. They stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had the watch. Every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day, with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for one another on that day than on any day in the year, and had shared to some extent in its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while listening to the moaning of the wind and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss whose depths were secret and profound as death. It was a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it at his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha ha ha ha! It seems fair that while sickness and sorrow can spread, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor." When Scrooge's nephew laughed this way, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and all their friends laughed too. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Scrooge's nephew. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, indignantly. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he is very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "You, at least, always told me so." "What of that, my dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew. "I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it if he finds me going there, in good temper, year after year, and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something, and I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, just so long as they laughed, he encouraged them in their merriment. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family. They sang with glee, and Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp. She played one particular simple little tune, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things that ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade that buried Jacob Marley. But they didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while they played games, for it is good to be children sometimes, and never better than at Christmas. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played, and so did Scrooge. For wholly forgetting in the interest he had in what was going on that his voice made no sound to their ears, he sometimes came out with his guess quite loud, and very often guessed quite right, too. For the sharpest needle was not sharper than Scrooge, blunt as he took it in his head to be. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and he looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed, but this the spirit said could not be done. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so happy and light of heart that he would have thanked them all in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene faded quickly, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but Scrooge had his doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's party, when looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was now gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Night, at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing 11:15 at that moment. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe. "But I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your robes. Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for the flesh is there upon it. Look here." From the foldings of its robe it brought two children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung upon the outside of its garment. "Man, look here. Look down here," exclaimed the ghost. There was a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling and wolfish, but humble, it seemed, as well. Graceful youth should have filled their features out, yet instead they were shriveled and twisted and gaunt. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown to him in this way, he tried to say they were fine children, but the words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are humanity's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing to their parent. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. Deny it," cried the spirit, stretching out its hand towards the city. Slander those who tell it ye. Admit it for your factious purpose, and make it worse, and abide the end. Have they no refuge? No resource? Cried Scrooge. There no shelters? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. There no food banks? The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming in, like a mist along the ground, towards him. I hope you've enjoyed this third installment of A Christmas Carol. Happy Solstice, Merry Yule, Merry Christmas, and Happy Hanukkah to everyone. Thank you for spending some of your time with me today. If you've enjoyed your time, please like, subscribe, share, comment. I'm Skaji. Safe journeys.